I don't believe we are even close to having a clear path towards what this technology is really about. So what do I want to raise doubt about? I want to raise doubt about conventional way of thinking about things, all the way to the base of it, as in raise doubt about our assumption about what physical reality is, and perceptual reality and all of that. So yesterday we had 2.5 hours dedicated to hopefully raising doubt that the world we think is outside our heads is not really what we think it is. And also the world that we think is inside our heads is not really what we think it is either. So let's continue on that path today. We started heavy on theory. That was also a little bit on purpose. I think that might have also scared a little bit people off, because yesterday was about almost anything but virtual reality. We did introduce a little bit of that with homuncular flexibility. Today we'll start going more and more into VR. I just think it's really necessary that we collectively have a theoretical basis before we go too much into actual VR applications, but that's where we're going to end up. So we're going to end up in day one having been basically 95% theory and only 5% about VR or less. And in day 4, we're going to be 100% VR. But the way we're going to discuss is hopefully be based somewhat on these kind of concepts that we're familiarizing ourselves with now. So this is the summary we left yesterday with. We said the point of that discussion was to argue for a gap between objective reality and the human reality. We also argued that the mechanism that generates the human reality is malleable. That is, we are born with a certain equipment. We're born with a certain perceptual system and with a brain that is processing that information from the perceptual system in certain kind of ways. But we started to explore to what degree is that fixed, and to what degree is it not. Of course, this is a monumental question, and we're never going to see the end of it. Definitely not within these 4 days. But I do think it's critical in the context of VR that we at least start to get a basic feel for that. And then we asked some further hard questions like, where are the strings? If this mechanism that connects an unknown world to the human world is malleable, then where are the strings, and who's pulling them? Is technology pulling them? So, and then I said yesterday that we're gonna try to dive into these things, then sleep on them, and then meet the next day and try to summarize and contextualize. Then we go further, and then we kind of go in loops like that. So we're gonna come back every day to a summary of what we said the day before, plus the new stuff, and like continuously try to recontextualize. So that's why I was telling you, don't try to put everything together in day one. We're going to keep trying to put it together and keep trying to put it together, which from my perspective is, the heart of what it means to do research, to do implementation of new ideas, to think of new ideas in the context of new technology, kind of from the ground up. So very briefly, these are all the stuff we covered yesterday, which actually when I wrote it down this morning, I was like, holy shit, we really went through a lot yesterday. So let's just go down the list. We, by the way, on my screen, there's like this Zoom UI things on the top, but I think you can see the full screen, right?
Yeah, it's fine. Okay. Sometimes it blocks, but here we can see everything.
All right, perfect. So we started by discussing what's called the correspondence theory of truth. So this is the idea that there is some kind of physical reality out there, and the reality that we can know through our nervous system and perceptual mechanism has some kind of correspondence to that reality out there. So in other words, we're not completely making things up, at least not everything, right? There is some correspondence of truth. And the diagram on the right is like the homomorphism in set theory, which shows, again, there are two sets and there's some relationship. That does not mean that there are no elements in one of the sets that has no correspondence to the other set. It does not mean that the relationship is one-to-one, right? There's some mathematical relationship. So there's some kind of departure. But there is a certain degree of correspondence. So many people do not that many, but interesting people, more and more interesting people are coming out with more and more evidence and theories to show that this might not be true, to show that actually they can prove mathematically that we make everything up. But for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to ignore them. Maybe that's a discussion for another day. And we're just going to assume that there is some kind of correspondence. Then we looked at what's called inactive cognition. And this is proposing a mechanism called structural coupling between humans and this world out there. So it's basically trying to come up with some take on what those little arrows are that's connecting the two sets. So the example that Varela, which is the father of inactive cognition, gave that really stuck to me after reading his book, The Embodied Mind, is bees and flowers, right? So rather than making a strict distinction between an animal and the environment, or in other words, some theories are calling this distinctions between subject and object. He's saying, forget about that. It's not a case that there were like flowers in the world and then the animal called bee evolved so that it can work with flowers and serve flowers, and the flowers serve the bee. It's much more likely that both flowers and bees started and evolved together. So they became a bee and they became flowers because of the structural coupling, or through a structural coupling that he posits between these two things. So you can't really separate the evolution of a creature from the evolution of the environment. They all kind of evolve together. And the situation in reality, assuming this is true, is of course far, far more complex, because we don't have just bees and flowers. We have almost an infinite number of creatures and relationships between those creatures. And we also have various degrees of agents and with various agencies and so on. So this inactive cognition is trying to, again, find a way to explain the correspondence, or what kind of correspondence is out there. Then we talked about how we looked at perception. We discussed a lot of examples and studies that show how human perception is really fickle. And we look at a lot of things that a lot of people consider tricks. So and a lot of people talk about these, they read these studies and they say, okay, but the lab people just play tricks on these testers. And we consider the fact that maybe those are not tricks. Maybe our brain is really so malleable. Maybe in a sense, we are made to be tricked, quote unquote, because that's what's making us so flexible. And yet, why is it that when we walk on the street or we go about our daily life, we do not see these illusions, at least on very, very rare occasions? And to find an answer to that, we turn towards phenomenology, and specifically to Merleau-Ponty, that says that these illusions do not happen on a daily basis because the world is thick with meaning. What he means by that is that we live in a social world where every object that we see and that we touch has a story that is a human story. So it fits very neatly into what human life is about. And of course, the story about human life and the kind of objects we surround ourselves with is very much fantasy. And we're surrounded with two kinds of objects in physical reality: objects that we have created that of course fit our fantasy because we made them fit a fantasy. So things like keyboards and mice. And we are also surrounded by objects from nature, but those are also thickly integrated into the human story, even if they're like trees and grass and everything. So we are not able to objectively perceive them. They all fit into our version of the world. Then we went on into some cognitive neuroscientists coming from different backgrounds like linguistics and psychology, to see again, to go inside the mind. And we looked at Lakoff and Johnson, so they're linguists working in cognitive neuroscience, and they made statements like sensory motor interfaces are used in abstract thought. So they propose that things we learn by moving our body in physical reality are then somehow used in processing abstract concepts. And this is whoa, wow. So again, there is just no way to neatly process this. Then we went on to Barbara Tversky, who is a psychologist, but again, running labs doing research in cognitive neuroscience for several decades. And she has her 9 laws of cognition. And the 5th law is this: spatial thinking is the foundation of abstract thought. So she's going even further, I feel like, than Lakoff and Johnson. Lakoff and Johnson are more about like moving the body. She goes straight to spatiality and spatial thinking. And she's saying it's the spatial nature of human life that's actually the foundation of abstract thought. So again, that's like quite a profound statement. We'll go into that a bit deeper as well today. Connected to this, we looked at research around a concept called homuncular flexibility. And this basically says, and this is actually should be in inverted commas, it's straight from their abstract, new human, that there's a new human experience of inhabited non-humanoid bodies that is opening up to us through VR. And lastly, we looked at what's called technologies of self, which is a concept promoted by French philosopher Foucault. And this is about how it feels to be you, how it feels to be a certain kind of individual. And I want us to stay a little bit on this slide and to start to make connections between these things. And we're going to also slowly start today to back up some of these connections. And I might go on right now and like just say some very blunt things I probably should not say in public, but I think we should just open things up a bit to speculation. So I might put my feet in my mouth a few times, but I'm okay with that. So I should have given numbers to this, but basically what jumped out at me when I first wrote these down and just in this whole body of research that I've been doing is, of course, the reliance on the body. And even this sentence from Lakoff and Johnson that sensory motor interfaces are used in abstract thought. Barbara Tversky, spatial thinking. Of course, we are familiar with the spatiality because our body is moving through space, and that's the only way we can understand space. There is some research I'm going to quote later from Tversky that says that in many cases, when she had people in the lab that had to do cognitive tasks for certain kind of studies, she always had a group of them do the same tasks sitting on their hands. And most of those people who sat on their hands could not do the cognitive task. And the cognitive task usually had something to do with assembly of pieces or map making, either actual drawing of maps or describing routes through the environment. But she was always very interested in the fact that once the body is actually upside down, there seems to be some interference in those people's ability to think clearly, to clearly manipulate these concepts in their mind. So if we learn all of these things through our bodies, and our bodies have this body schema, right, where we have 2 hands and 2 feet. We also have a predilection for things in front of us. We have a predilection for things above us rather than things below us. So there's this entire hierarchy of directions. And this hierarchy of organizing things and direction is also taking into abstract thought and in language. So then when you look at like homuncular flexibility, well, stuff like this comes to my mind. Well, what if we start to inhabit non-human bodies, and these non-human bodies start to have different sensory motor interfaces just because they might not have 2 hands and 2 feet? What if our way of traversing space or interacting with objects in space start to develop new habits? How is that going to start to affect the way we process things, if indeed all of these people are correct, if we use these spatial thinking and the sensory motor interfaces in abstract thought? So that's kind of that's like the first thing that I want to throw out there as an example of the kind of connections and inferences that we're going to attempt to make. And then, of course, always try to back up with examples as we keep going. So I want to stop here for a second and see if anyone wants to jump in, either with reactions to what I just said or with just throwing thoughts out there based on the things on this slide.
I guess I'll jump in, but please, everyone else, speak up, or else I'm gonna take all the floor. But one of the things I read yesterday in like rereading the homuncular flexibility and an article by Janet Murray called "Virtual/Reality: How to Tell the Difference," about this idea of like the magical thinking about how total the illusion of virtual reality is, like this idea that one day it will completely replace reality and be somewhat indistinguishable. One of the things she was saying about these psychological or cognitive neuroscience studies about like all these phenomena, the Proteus effect, the just this idea of the effects that derive from inhabiting these other bodies are, one, very hard to accomplish. Like you need to be in very specific conditions in order to succeed in creating the effects, and they wear off relatively quickly. Perhaps it's because they're short studies, so the effect is the same, is relatively short. So perhaps if we live in these altered bodies much longer, the effects would be much longer. But yeah, I try to come back to this, to nuance these kind of claims, whereas for the moment, whatever effect might be created by these inhabiting other bodies, I think is relatively, the effects will wear off relatively quickly as far as the research that I saw.
Yeah, there's so many layers that require clarification in this discussion. That's why I was like, I keep talking about how worried I am getting into it, but in the same time, I feel like a compulsion of just getting it started because I feel it's so important. So related to what you said, we're talking about habits, for example, that develop in virtual reality is not necessarily the same thing as talking about thought processes. So that's the first distinction that I think it's important to make, but not that easy to understand, right? Because we'll have to go deeper into the definition of habits and the definition of thought processes. I do have some examples later of what's called game transfer phenomena. So those are habits that people developed in virtual reality that are being carried over to physical reality, and they last. So I would say there is some indication of habits that are carried over, but it is hard for me to, of course, make the argument that it's the thinking processes as well, although they're not completely separated from each other. And again, since I'm not a scientist and I'm just kind of taking people, I talk to people, I do it myself, but I do not run studies that say, okay, this behavior was carried over and it lasted for this long. So I don't have the kind of data. My job is just to like raise question marks. But yes, so we need more clarity to get forward in the discussion between behavior and thought processes. So that's kind of what I'm taking from the question that you raised. We also need to be aware of timescales are really important. So something that we should keep in the back of our minds is that some of the things that these scientists are talking about developed over very long time scales in human evolution. So we learn how to think, or we maybe we use some sensory motor interfaces in our thinking process, but maybe that happened over hundreds of thousands of years, right? Like we can only speculate on that. And then there's some other things that we do know have to do with the flexibility of our cognitive system and the adaptability and things like neuroplasticity that we do know can happen within hours. And again, it depends on the context in terms of how long they last. So again, it's hard to put our fingers on it, but we have to put in the effort of considering always in the back of our heads, what kind of time scale are we talking about? And also considering the fact that there are no answers to this. So we can go to many kind of papers and take all of these many perspectives and no one is going to give us a clear answer. But I just feel like we got to the point where we have this technology on our hands, and this technology is starting to trigger some of these mechanisms. In some case, in people that are very young, with the quote unquote risk of this technology going into like being produced at mass scale. So we're seeing some hints of these mechanisms, and yet, since we cannot, there's no one that can give us clear answer, I feel like at least we can have a discussion that starts to raise some questions. And then one last comment related to what you said. Have you heard of Giuseppe Riva? He's an Italian. I can bring this up. I can bring this up next tomorrow. So he's an Italian researcher that is trying to use some of these mechanisms to treat certain conditions. And he has, for example, a protocol where he's using virtual reality and identification with a virtual avatar to treat eating disorders. And he has a paper out where he's able to achieve results. I think I have to read the paper again, but I think is within 8 sessions. So so far he's claiming that these are very lasting results. Like at that time, he has not seen reversals of the progress that he's made, which means that whatever is happening in the brain when you identify with this avatar, which in the case of this study has a different body size than your actual body size, once that identification happens, there's something that is quite profound and lasting in the brain. So on one hand, I agree with you. On the other hand, there is research coming out of labs like Giuseppe Riva's that hint at certain things being actually long lasting. Okay, some people have their hands up. Jessica?
Hi, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Hi. So I kind of wanted to like share like my reflection. Like it sounds like what you're doing is you're laying out the like all of the cognitive like neuroscience theories that, and then you're actively theory building in front of us. And so it sounds like you're laying the foundation, and then it seems like where we're going is like towards this new theory and like also potentially like applications to the technology as well. And I just wanted to check that with you before I made any more assumptions.
Yes, that is what I'm doing. At the end of the 4th day, we'll have a theory that I did not have in the beginning. correct.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Alexis, you have your hand up.
Hi, yes. I just wanted to bring up, there's a really amazing book by David Eagleman called Live Wired, and it talks a lot about the neuroplasticity, but talking about how we are constantly rewiring our brain. He's kind of done some research into how technologies can develop our senses and so on, or kind of give us new perceptions of things and integrate data in very flexible ways, and how we're always constantly navigating or negotiating cognitive territory. So there is this capacity, this aspect of habit and how it's sort of maintained over time for whether we can develop a parallel paradigm. And there's been research of like people putting physical adjustments to their pinna, their ears, and learning how to spatialize sound with a new physical appendages. And so it seems that the same would hold true in a new environment in VR as well. But I think, yeah, the neuroscience seems to support this idea through, and he brings a lot of the ideas in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I love reading his stuff, and he's been doing this thing like the sensory substitution vest and things like that for quite a while now. So his body of work is very mature by now. Super interesting. All right, anyone else want to jump in? There's some crazy speculation. All right, so I have a quick question. Do you guys still see that this is being recorded? Because when I'm in screen share, my UI looks different, so I don't see that being recorded thing, but you still see it?
It's being recorded.
Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna come back to Tversky every day. This is just a little bit going deeper into that fifth law of cognition that she has. Spatial thinking is the foundation of abstract thought, because as I mentioned yesterday, that's kind of where we're going. So here are a few crumbs. She talks on page 17 of her book about how they've done these brain studies for apes. I think they were chimps, I'm not sure. They taught them how to use a rake. And then they noticed that after they get good at using a rake, the brain regions that keep track of the area around the hand as it moves expand to include the rake as well as the hand. This is very interesting because it's connected to what we talked yesterday in the context of when we're driving a car, we feel like we plus the car are kind of this big thing and we're aware of the front and back of the car. Blind people report feeling that they have nervous endings at the tip of the cane. So this is a study that shows this happening in primates and actually shows brain scans with clear evidence for this expansion at the neural level of this functionality. So again, I'm bringing this up in terms of quote unquote evidence and hoping to raise further questions when it comes to us inhabiting and actually believing that we're inhabiting non-human bodies and what that might mean. And as a way for us to start to, I feel like we need to, as VR developers or as people interested in working in VR, if we see this kind of evidence, of course, we're not scientists in any way, but I feel like we need to be able to build some muscle when it comes to evaluating these things and making these kind of connections. So I'm going to start to throw these things out there. The other thing that she brings up quite a lot is the fact that across human evolution, she ran into a lot of instances where there are parts of the body that pick up very important, compelling new functions. Like we still use our mouth for eating, but we also recently in our evolution as an animal, we have started to use our mouth for speaking. And when you look at what that has happened in the brain, there is evidence that all structures pick up new functions. So both in evolution and in development. So it's not just that it is that body part that has added another function. This addition of function on top of an old structure is being also noted at a neural level. Then going more into this this idea of space and our thoughts happening in space. She says, whenever you return home to fetch your umbrella, you rely on a world in your mind, not in view. And this is a very simple kind of statement, but somehow something made me read it a few times, and then it kind of flipped in my head from like, oh, okay, sure, of course, to a bit of a wow moment, to the fact that we really walk around with a miniature version of the world. And of course, again, this is nothing new. A lot of research is dedicated to this. But this is very important in the context in which later in the book, she starts to look for ways in which we think that has no relationship to space or to spatial arrangement. And it's actually not that easy. It turns out that quite a lot of mental processes have connections to some sense of space and structure in space, and including, for example, the way we think of time. So we think of linear time, we think of circular time. So even our ability to conceptualize time and to operate on a timeline is using a spatial metaphor. Then another thing that's absolutely amazing, and by the way, of course, I will not have time to go into all of these in depth tomorrow. So if there's something that I'm mentioning now that is of interest to you, please write it down and just bring it up. You can even bring it up maybe at the end of today or tomorrow, because I have the book right behind me, so we can just flip to that page. Or if you're interested in like what exactly does she mean by that, or the full example, we can just like pick up the book and read it together right now. She says, so other amazing things like this: distortions in people's cognitive maps are mirrored in people's social maps, which really also blew me away. So just to give you a brief summary of this conversation, she ran some experiments in her lab where she noticed that, of course, we have some, what are they called? We have some cognitive biases, right? Cognitive biases. So an example of cognitive bias, we tend to put things into categories, and sometimes there are similarities between things that are actually in different categories. So two things in different categories for some reason might be actually very, very close to each other, but we don't recognize them as such. Once we put them in a category, we will describe them as far away from each other as possible. So we kind of get blinded by the fact that they might actually be very, very close together. And she shows through studies in her lab how we first do that with physical locations. So if we say a city, or these kind of cities are in this kind of state in the US, and these cities, so she has like, I forget the actual examples, again, we should look it up. So there's these cities in a state, and then there's another state, a neighboring state that has these cities. Sometimes one city in a state can be very, very close to another city in a state, but assuming you don't actually live there, so you're not very familiar with the geography, you will in your mind, you will just imagine those cities as super far away, basically just completely two different categories. And this is a system in which the category takes over and defines all the properties of whatever is in that category. So that's kind of type of cognitive biases that we're talking about. And then she has examples about how we do the same thing when it comes to social categories and social interactions. And she's arguing, and you can, I think here maybe there's some room for disagreement, that we learn how to form these categories and we learn the structure of the categories by first interacting with objects in a physical reality and developing categories that way. And then we use the same structure, the same categorical structure for things that have to do with our social reality. So of course, any distortion and biases that we develop by structuring physical reality, we take those distortion and biases and they also appear, and she's tracking them down in the way we're structuring social reality. Next one, mental construction mimics physical construction in that it's step-by-step from parts. This is also fascinating. And again, it's kind of building up on the previous point. She has studies where she's trying to basically understand or start to get some answers to the question, what is thinking process, right? This is still doesn't have a clear definition. So she gets people in the lab and she asks them to solve things. So manipulate abstract concepts with their mind. And then she's asking all sorts of questions, trying to understand why people did the way they did it, or she asked things like, okay, so to get to this result, you first did this, and then you assumed this, and then you did that, and then you did that. And then she's trying to understand, where does that come from? Like, what is the structure of that first this, and then that, and then that? And she has some examples where things were just fishy. Like her and her team just couldn't really put their finger on where that structure was. And in some cases, it kind of clicked that people were actually using structures to manipulate these abstract ideas that also exist when you manipulate certain things in real life. So she calls it drawing order. Those of you who are architects are familiar with this. Like when you're making an architectural drawing, there's a certain order in which you do things because there's certain logic and restrictions of that. And you kind of have to do it that way. You can't like make it up because that's the most efficient way, because you're dealing with limitations of, pen and paper, or sometimes if you're actually building something of construction materials. So she postulates through these studies that we take this quote unquote drawing order that we learn by interacting with physical reality and its limitations, and then that's what we apply to start to solve abstract problems. And then last one, I already mentioned this one. So some participants, when asked to do the same things upside down on their hands, absolutely cannot do it. There's something about the upright position and orientation that just they cannot do without. It literally turns the problem upside down. And for her, this is relevant because she's arguing that all the mental operations happen in space, and that, of course, the space we're familiar with has this very strong up, down, left, right orientation through the physical body. Any thoughts related to these crumbs of research?
Yeah, it's bringing up so much memories of like studying sociology for architects, and like when they drag out George Simmel, like Metropolis and Mental Life, and how we adapt to the noise, the background noise of like cities. And I think Simmel talked about the protective organ that like helps us make sense, create some way to live in this new environments. From there, like this sort of dramaturgical school, this whole social layer of like talking about, I guess we're talking about mental structures right now, but like there's this whole social structures as well. It's been theorized, and people like Irving Goffman and Richard Sennett, and then the whole emergence of that field of sociology that's been very tied to architecture as well. But yeah, frame analysis from Goffman and sort of his look, some of his little vignettes about like front stage and backstage spaces, I think can be really useful to tie into some of the more cognitive like science stuff as well. It's just bringing up a lot of memories of like reading these texts.
Oh, absolutely. And if you would like to share with everyone else, like maybe a specific book or essay from him, I will, if you email it to me, I will share it with everyone.
Sure, I'll put some in chat.
Yeah, totally. And I for me, what's kind of striking, and I guess the extra coming out of a very similar background of an architectural education, is things like people's cognitive maps are mirrored in people's social maps, because I guess we tend to think of these things as two different things, but seeing very brave research trying to argue that there are these parallels. There was also another quote that we had yesterday that said that, actually I think it's number 8 maybe out of her 9 laws of cognition. The way we organize physical reality is how we organize the content of our mind. So for me, I guess this is kind of like a little bit the wow piece. And then the other thing, maybe also looking at these things as an architect, because when I read these sentences, I actually see spaces, right? Like it's not just when I read the stuff with the fetch your umbrella, like I literally see a hallway and I can see like the pattern of the wood floor, and I can see kind of the Louis XV little table and then an oval mirror, and that's where I'm like, it's like I'm kind of like I have like hyperphantasia in my head, so I'm like I see all these details when I read all this stuff. But it's not just in the case of the umbrella example. In all these other cases, I start to like build stuff in my head, and the exercise going one by one like that is, could we use virtual reality to build things that might propose different structures, different spatial structures, and different ways in which we interact with those spatial structures? So if the answer to that is yes, and I see no reason why the answer to that would be no, and these statements are even a little bit true, then what does that mean? So that's kind of where we're heading. Any other thoughts or reactions to these kind of things?
Yeah. So how do we sort of take this theory and design an experiment and or an application to sort of tease out these implied structures and make them more concrete and less specific to a given context? Like in the case of architecture, that would be your step process. This comes before that, this comes after that. Aside from like a machine learning style approach where you abstract all of that discipline specific jargon away, how do we sort of get to the point where we find the underlying structure that sort of helped generate that pattern or that structure to begin with? And then what do we do when we find it?
So the short answer is, I'm on it. The long answer, or the second short answer, is I don't really know. I haven't figured it out. So I have a two-fanged approach, right? So on one hand, I'm doing all this reading and trying to do this theoretical work, trying to develop this. I'm trying to develop both an intuition for these things by just spending a lot of time in VR and experimenting on myself. And then I'm trying to develop this top-down understanding by reading this research. And on the other hand, I am involved in a few projects that I've initiated. Some of them, including people like Bob Horn, who is like this, he's an emeritus professor at Stanford. He's the father of visual arguments and infographics. He's very much working in this vein. We're trying to get Barbara Tversky to join this. So I'm trying to structure teams and projects that have a team of developers attached to them that actually start to do exactly what you just said. And the second part of your question, what do we do when we figure it out, or what exactly are they for? I have lots of thoughts on that, but maybe we come back to that in 2 days. But yes, that's just wildly fascinating, and I guess that's there are things that are almost hard to verbalize because the stuff that come to mind is so crazy, right? So maybe the most out there thing we do in this workshop is try to verbalize it if we have the courage to go on record with it. But I think we should at the end. Any other thoughts? Like I wish people would. I don't want to rush in any way through these things. I think this is so important, and it's so important to take our time. So if anyone wants to share anything else.
Just as
I
an
guess
idea.
yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, like you mentioned that also at the end yesterday, that it's important to me, okay, on the one hand to embrace this post-disciplinary approach, but on the other hand to really define a direction to be a bit more distilled about the ideas that you already present. And I was wondering, does one need to define a discipline, or is it about defining a process? Because a discipline, it's a bit like the subject discussion from yesterday. It's all about limits. It's defining entities with a clear cell in any form, be it material or conceptual. And I just wonder if the most important aspect in this whole conversation is its porosity, the ability to be permeated through different concepts, fields, aspects of thought, embodiments. I just wonder how much of this abstraction is it really feasible or even wanted? If you learn so much from a physical experience, then how can we keep this process of actually learning, these passageways that you kind of define and map out in the text that you quote? How do we keep this kind of information and transitions?
So let me, I think I will come back to you about the second part. The first part about the discipline. The truth is, I don't really know what the best word is for this. I don't know if this is truly a new discipline or not. I think what Carl asked earlier, like he phrased the heart of it with such clarity that I'm still shaken by it. It's basically what Carl asked. If we can actually do the kind of things we're starting to imply in these discussions, then what do we do with it? Then what is that? What is the power of that? To what extent does it go? And what do we do with it? And I think that also includes your question, Maria, about is it needed or is it wanted? So I don't know to what extent this is a new discipline. I think it's something different. I think it goes beyond a new medium for sure in its potential. I think it goes beyond a new discipline as well, or maybe beyond is too much said. It's something slightly different than a new discipline, because for me, a new discipline is like each discipline defines a certain way of acquiring knowledge. So for me, discipline is, in a sense, each discipline is a epistemological project. So epistemology, the science of acquiring knowledge and how humans acquire new knowledge. So those are what the different disciplines are for me. With the argument that every discipline goes into an area and and claims a unique kind of knowledge, right? So mathematics claims to be able to target and acquire a unique kind of human knowledge that anthropology cannot, and the other way around. Like anthropology claims to tackle some piece of human knowledge that other disciplines do not. So can we claim to tackle some new kind of knowledge to define a new discipline? I don't know. Is this something else? I think it might be, because of the implications, the very strong implications about. I feel like there's a practicality and an engineering side to this almost, that's slightly different than how I would the epistemological definition of discipline. So I don't have a clear path on this. I do have a little and I can attempt to answer the question, is this needed? So first of all, we don't really know what this is. Hopefully we'll have a better idea in a few days, but I do welcome the question, even so early on, even before we know what it is. The thing that, for example, Bob Horn and I are working on now, he has this book called The Little Book of, what is it called? Like knotty problems, I think he calls them, something like that. So it's a list of, it's absolutely brilliant. It's a list of problems in the world that people do not seem to be able to wrap their heads around. So it's very complex cognitive issues, or sometimes not so complex, but that are phenomena that very much happen in the world, because we go to the point when the human world has such a high degree of complexity. There is so much emerging phenomena that we have a hard time understanding. We're seeing emergence happening in all sorts of areas of human life. And these knotty problems are things that we just can't seem to get a grasp on. And it's because our cognitive mechanism is just so limited in so many ways. Like we don't feel like that. And in a way, we're meant not to feel our limitations. It's kind of like, when you're in your 20s, you know you're gonna die someday, but you feel like there's eternity in front of you. Whereas when you hit middle age, you kind of start to have this feeling that, oops, half is gone, I just have half. So there's something in you that kind of limits you from really seeing the full picture. So one way in which I'm answering what is it for is going at the moment in this direction, in trying to find ways to maybe use virtual reality to tackle cognitive limitations that, in my opinion, are becoming critical already and definitely in the near future. But again, that's a little bit of a conversation for another day. Was there a second part to your question that I did not answer? I feel like there was something there in the last two sentences that you said that I didn't fully grasp. Did I leave something out? And if I did, could you repeat it?
Both yes and no. The last part was about the porosity of ideas. So, but I have an answer already from you right now, because what I was asking you is, okay, do you really need to make it so specific? Do you lose perhaps something by the process of making it very specific? And you gave me an answer. You told me, yes, I have a reason, because I want to have a direction, and I already have pretty much a direction. And kind of the side comment or the side thought is, direction, nevertheless, it's definitely an important target, a beautiful direction general. But how do we keep the multiplicity of those sources alive, even while the ideas and the concepts are getting more and more distinct? As you know better and more clear, how can you keep this complexity of experiences, thoughts, and disciplines, you name it, all the different layers, the cognitive layers that you bring in, alive? That's pretty much the question.
Got it. Got it. So I do have a clear answer to that, which is from the perspective of myself and my work. We're not, or I'm not. I don't believe that's possible. I think I'm already in a process where as I'm this is what I'm showing you now is very much still the beginning rough part, but as I'm getting more and more into it, I am losing the porosity. I am losing the multivalence of these ideas, and some of that is not good, but I do deeply believe that it's necessary for me to actually get somewhere, because unlike a lot of other theorists that just deal with the ideas, and for whom it's very important to always remain in this space of porosity and flexibility, I think that's wonderful, but is not what my work is about. My work is very much about taking us to a place that is a concrete implementation of these things with a concrete goal. So yes, I will lose a lot of the richness that is on the table right now, but that's just the price I'm ready to pay. This is wonderful. I love all of these directions. Anyone else would like to jump in? All right. Is this a good time, Philip? Is this a good time for a break?
I guess so. We've been going on for an hour, but if we can also just all agree that, this is recorded, it's going to be put online. If anyone needs to go, they can just close their screen, their camera, and go. It's mostly for you as the instructor. Like, it can be a lot to talk for 2.5 hours. So yeah, I guess we just have to decide, do we want to take like a structured break, or we're virtual, so we can take advantage of the affordances of being virtual if you want.
I'm good either way, but I do think it's important we have this conversation, because I know for some people it's important for their brain to take a break or go a bathroom break. I know it's not easy, even if you listen, to just keep going for over an hour. So where do other people stand on this? Should we just break for 5-10 minutes? Go. All right.
I'm good to continue.
Good.
If I'll just sit down maybe.
To use
otherwise,
sometimes a brief break for questions or discussion that can also work as a break. I think that's great.
Yep. Okay, so we just did some questions. Now and we are 1 hour in. Then let me just share my screen again, and we continue. Okay, so day 2, we're gonna throw a few more things at the wall, but again, going closer and closer towards the target and getting more specific with VR. So so there are 3 more things that I want to add to this list, and then, unless something compelling comes up that I've completely forgotten about, we'll stop we'll stop with this. We'll finalize that list, but these are the new things that I do think are very important to have on that list, because again, that's what we will start every day with, and we'll add these things to it tomorrow. This thing called game transfer phenomena, we kind of touched on this, right? With Philip's comment about maybe it's wrong to assume that if you inhabit some kind of avatar, things will last for long, or the changes that you experience will also transfer. How long will they transfer for? I will include the research that I mentioned from Giuseppe Riva. But I want to bring some examples that do not have to do with avatars that I think are also very relevant. So one is something that maybe some of you who have heard me talk before have heard this example. If you've heard me explain it many times, I apologize for the repetition. I do think it's worth bringing it up. So it's what I call my Control Z example. So this is the Control Z example. It is my first encounter with game transfer phenomena before I knew what this was, and it's not even in a game, but it goes like this. When I was an architecture student, and even long time after that, I used to make a lot of physical models. Like we had to produce in school, we had to produce plans and sections and all the kind of stuff you do with a computer, and virtual 3D models, and also physical models. You were not allowed to go into your exams or even consultation if you did not have an accompanying physical model. So we always, we used to work late in the studio, like 3-4 in the morning, like all the crazy architecture students. And we had the mouse and the keyboard and the screens, and then we always like working on the cardboard stuff on the side. And when it was getting really late and I was getting tired, this thing started to happen where I would work on the keyboard, and you always do Control Z, right? Like you move some stuff around, you move a window around, you don't like it, like because you're going through the design process, right? So you're like, okay, window right, window left, do I like it? Now Control Z, roof up, roof down, wall up, longer, shorter, Control Z, I don't like it. So the Control Z was like, basically every two moves would be just Control Z, because you would be going back and forth between stuff in designing things. And then I would like unroll those parts of the virtual building that I did. I would go to the laser cutter, I would cut them out of cardboard, and then I would start gluing them together, and sometimes get ideas and start to cut them with the scissors, and start to do new things, and then go into that same creative process where try things. And when my brain was really tired, because it was like 4 a.m, I would my left hand, as I would hold a piece of cardboard, my left hand would twitch into the Control Z position, like my fingers, my thumb and my small finger, I don't know what this is called, would just go into the Control Z position. And it was always surprising. I mean, not scary in any way, but it was like, oh, like I would just, as if I would catch myself in the act of doing something completely irrational and slightly like psychotic. I'm like, oh my God, that was like signal that I have to go to bed. But thinking about this now from the perspective of all of these conversations, it made me realize that what was actually happening is my brain was kind of getting into the world of this 3D software that had a ledger that was registering all the actions that I was doing in that virtual environment. And you could go back in time. You could Control Z and go back one step in that ledger. And then you go Control Z again and you go back again one step. But in physical reality, mysteriously, we have the arrow of time, which only goes in one direction. So there's no ledger that records all my actions and allows me to go back. And my brain couldn't tell those two things apart when it was like after 4 a.m. So, and that felt so real to me. And then it started to raise all these questions, and it started an interest of mine in tracking what people are starting to say about similar examples that they encounter after prolonged use of VR. And at some point, I asked this on Twitter. I asked people to share with me examples of things like this. And these are a few of the answers that I got. So this user says, I remember after spending 5 hours a day in Google Blocks for like weeks, I kept wanting to move around by grabbing the world and scaling it and pulling it towards me. And again, because of my Control Z episodes, which still continue to this day, if anything, getting worse, I'm taking this quite literally, right? Because I feel like if you've not experienced something like this yourself, you might not know to what extent this is quote unquote actual or real. But I can assure you this is very, very real. This is absolutely your brain being confused at a level we've really not seen it before. Another user says they've played a game in all space, and then when they play the same game in real life, they kept trying to click on the cards and were surprised that there was no auto shuffle or animation. They also kept looking above people's heads, like about like actual people's heads, and experienced surprise because there was no label with their name or a block button. This person, John, talks about how many times he goes into his actual closet looking for an outfit, only to realize that that outfit was in an avatar that he had in these other realities. But because some of the actions that we're doing kind of parallel the actions in real life, not as in like, I guess the way you walk in your avatar is not the way you walk with your body, but the behavior and the intention in your head is like, oh, now I want to wear that. That's exactly the same kind of intention being processed in your brain. Going forward in the discussion, I think these are good examples from what I call bottom-up evidence, as opposed to the top-down scientific evidence that we can refer to if needed. Then another thing that I do want to mention, it's a bit different than this kind of very, very heavy theoretical road that we're on, is I'm very interested in people who, for some reason, well, either because they have a physical or a mental disability, basically, have a hard time feeling at home in physical reality. And these are the people who, in my opinion, really drive platforms like VR Chat. And I've talked to some of them, and it's absolutely fascinating the degree of freedom that these people experience. And these are also some of their replies to me on Twitter. So some of them say things like this: I identify more with my avatar in VR than in the real. My autism and other issues mean the world out there will never really fit me. So it has been a natural progression to live my life in VR. And we will go back to statements like this as well, because if we are thinking about cognitive processes as such a depth, taking into account people that have atypical cognitive processes is a very big part of this. And a lot of research, actually, even some of the research that we've been talking about, is studying people with atypical cognitive processes to start to shed light on what we call typical neural functioning. And things like this that, of course, I love. And this user says, it's weird seeing a photo of myself from VR. And, oh, I'm sorry. It's weird seeing a photo of myself from VR and naturally, instinctively identifying it as, hey, that's me. So this is almost poetic, except that this is no metaphor. It's really got to the point where some people identify more with a photo of themselves from VR, which is like just such a wonderful way of phrasing it. So there are definitely mechanisms in place that are allowing people to identify and transfer behavior and cognitive mechanisms and just daily life and very profound things like self-identification to these virtual worlds. And this is also a little bit unrelated, but I thought I'll drop it in here. So part of what I do on a daily basis is not so much all this theorizing, although like I usually read in the evening, but during the day, our practice focuses a lot at the intersection of architecture and virtual reality. And sometimes we also take over special actual architecture projects. And what I mean by that is things like this. Here, we're going to build a house for a family that has a disabled daughter. So they want us to use VR to make sure that every corner of the house is designed so that the disabled daughter that has certain kind of needs is able to easily access it from all corners. So this is not so much living in VR, is something completely different, is more using VR for creating things in the real life, but working with them and trying to get deeper into understanding the extent to which physical reality is not accommodating in many, many ways to people with disabilities has really kind of made me very interested in these kind of topics. And the third thing that I want to add to the list for tomorrow, again, this is not immediately connected, but it is something so monumental, I cannot not mention it. And I know some of you are already like, okay, Andrea, but like, how much are we going to widen the net? I promised this the last time, the last statement that's really going to widen the net. Then we close it and then we're like, okay, we're good. I think it's not possible to have any conversation, any meaningful conversation that's supposed to go somewhere anymore without taking into account that we're not the only agents anymore. So we have other kinds of, how do I want to define them? I don't want to use like, neural networks or all that kind of terminology. I don't want to get into that at all. I want to define it in a way that's a bit closer to our discussion. Let's define agents as non-human entities that are able to enter into structural coupling with the environment. So they're able to enter into this this connection in which things are exchanged between us and these other agents, or between agents themselves that have to do with the processing of data and knowledge about the environment and knowledge about the world. And these are agents that can process data, and these are agents that can affect change in that environment, and these are agents that can be affected by the environment. And in this case, the environment, of course, also includes us, humans. But it's so this is basically the definition of structural coupling, and we might go a little bit more into this tomorrow. You could say, okay, so this definition is also fit by, I don't know, we discover a new species of spider. So the spider would fit that definition. This new spider is in the environment and it's out there in my garden. I mean, do we really need to bring up this spider in this conversation? So no, but of course, what I'm hinting at is AI and neural networks and these new kind of artificial agents that are able to enter structural coupling at a very high level of abstraction. So the new spider in the garden does not enter in structural coupling with us at very high levels of abstraction and processing of information and changing the environment in any way. Oh, Philip, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to point to another resource that is that I encountered recently that goes in that same direction. So Matthew Lombard, who penned one of the first or more influential papers on presence, which for me has been very useful for discussing VR. I saw a keynote of his not too long ago where he was talking about technology as social actors, or the medium itself as social actors. So he was using the notion instead of agents of social actors, and quoting like participants saying stuff like the technology itself seemed to have a personality. So there's definitely some precedent for that as well. I mean, we're bound, or we're used to anthropomorphizing non-human objects or phenomena. So I think it goes in that same direction, but it becomes even more prevalent now with like you were saying, we don't necessarily need to go to AI, but there's definitely ways in which these media or technology are being coded as more alive. I guess I'll say it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. The author's name was Matthew Lombard. Is that what you said?
Yeah, Lombard with a
With
D
a
at
D
the end, I
at the
believe.
end. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely look that up. All right, so I'm gonna pause here. So these were the other three new, let's call them concepts, I wanted to introduce to that board. And I think now we could also do another conversation break and slow down a bit, also check the time, because the next section that I have is basically called Let's Dip Our Feet in the Water right now, because we spend a lot of time talking about theory. And as I said, I love it. I get like into a tunnel and can talk about it without sleeping or eating for days. Yeah, I know that is what it sounds. But I am also very, very dedicated to introducing actual implementation. So what I have coming up next is 4 approaches for virtual reality interfaces that we have either used for client work at Numena, or that we have kind of tongue-in-cheek played with so far. They're not going to be perfect illustrations for what we talked about that's coming. These are not it. These are kind of very early studies, but I do think it's vital we introduce them, and it's vital to also give you all actual implementations, however imperfect from the point of view of the theory, to talk about, because this is the moment where we need to connect not just the different pieces of theory to each other, but also to actual VR implementations.